Wonderful. And so good morning, everybody. Welcome to this presentation on opposition and resistance. I will share my screen and wait, put it on the right one. Give me a second. I always have this issue. Wait, I'm going to put it animation, slideshow, presenter view. There we go. Yes. Can everybody see my slides all right? Wonderful. Nicole, feel comfortable to stay on or to stay off during the presentation. It's fine by me either way. All right, and so presentation on opposition and resistance, such a popular topic. I would say both aggression that I presented on earlier this year, and the recordings available for that as well on the website. And this presentation on opposition and resistance, both of them together are probably the ones that I get the most questions on, the most requests for support, because they're so highly challenging. And when we don't understand the root of it, it makes it really tricky on how to address it, where it really makes it, really has an impact, and for us not to get discouraged in this dynamic. And so what we're going to be doing today is I'm going to unpack making sense of this phenomenon. Why is it that we get resistance and opposition from children, and our students, children, your own children, and of course, students that you work with? This picture is so precious. Just the face of this little girl says it all, that in her eyes, in her facial expression, the resistance to our directives. And so how do we go about getting this little girl to follow us, to take on our directives? And so there are many different symptoms that derive from this whole phenomenon, this instinct that we're going to talk about. And so these are just some examples of being oppositional, being defiant, being allergic to coercion. And so if the adult is trying to convince, how we see, even if it's something fun, that we see the right away, the resistance and the opposition to it, where we might see that the student is reactive and non-compliant and disobedient. That's such a strong word, being disobedient. I mean, do we really want our children and students to be obedient to us? It's a very strong word. In terms of being argumentative or belligerent, being rebellious, being obstinate, stubborn, being passive and to procrastinate. So this is at the other extreme, at the front end of things, where it's more subtle. Some of kids will drag their heels. They'll do it, but they'll do it backwards almost. And some will be completely oppositional and resistant, having some antisocial behavior and attitudes, and just the impulse to being bad. Not that they wake up in the morning saying, today I'm going to be bad, but when this instinct comes along, it pushes us to react in certain ways. And so rather than trying to focus on all of the symptoms at the top here and to think about how we're going to address each and one of these separately, we are going to look at the foundation of them at the bottom of the pyramid, of the iceberg, and to make sense of this. For some of you who have heard me speak before, I often go about different phenomenons through this analogy of the iceberg, of making sense of it at the root. And so the what's at the root of all of these behaviors is the instinct that Gordon Neufeld calls counterwill. Now, Gordon Neufeld didn't make up this term. It is actually another author from many years ago called Otto Rank that spoke of counterwill in his literature. And so Gordon Neufeld got the idea of it from this author. And so the idea of, rather than calling it being oppositional, that we are countering the will of others. And so it's not that we are purposefully wanting to oppose, but when we're feeling the coercion and the pressure of the will of somebody else, sometimes it bubbles into us and it makes us react in a certain way. Now, I want you guys to think about even yourselves as adults, because it helps us to understand others when we can make sense of it within ourselves. So think about days where, let's say you're going to the store to shop for something, and you are not really in the mood to chat to anybody. You're kind of in your bubble and you're in a bit of a rush. you kind of just want to do your thing, and you're perusing into the store and looking for what is it you need, and you're not really needing help in that moment. But then you get this overzealous worker in the store that is there to want to try to convince you to buy, let's say, a top that they convince that it's the nicest color on you, and oh my goodness, you should try it. Everything in you might, in that moment, although you might have wanted to try the top, now that you've got the clerk in the store that is trying to convince you to buy it, all of a sudden in you, it pushes your buttons in a way where it may change your mind about even trying it at all. There might be another example completely different. You're at home and you've just finished dinner, and now it's a time to do the dishes. And oh my goodness, there's so many dishes piled up in the sink, and you just don't feel like doing it. And then you're barely about to convince yourself to say, oh shucks, if I don't do it now, it's going to be there tomorrow, and it's going to get worse, and it's going to pile up, and so I'm going to start doing it. And as you're about to get to the sink to do it, your spouse comes along and says something like, uh honey, you're gonna do the dishes? Like, they're starting to, in a very sarcastic kind of tone, they're starting to pile up, and today's your turn. And so, you really should be doing the dishes. And so the should being, you should be doing the dishes, although you're about to maybe convince yourself to do them, now all of a sudden becomes a bigger chore. All of a sudden, we don't really feel like doing the dishes anymore. And we may even talk ourselves out of doing it altogether. And so all of these examples that I am giving are examples of the counterwill instinct. We all have this instinct. It is not that kids have it more than adults. We are all born with this instinct, and this instinct has a purpose. And so the counterwill instinct, which is the instinct to push back against the will of others, or is a defensive reaction to perceived control and coercion, has a purpose. But before I talk about the purpose, I kind of want to unfold a little bit. When we're saying the word will, countering the will of others, what does that mean to have a will? And so the will of a person includes the following: whether it's about our values or our goals, our designs and purposes in life, our intentions, our initiatives, our preferences and priorities, our judgments and opinions, expectations and hopes, plans and decisions, wants and wishes. All of this is part of our will. This is what motivates us to act or to take certain decisions. And so when somebody else's will pushes us against our own desire and will, then this can create a sense of pushback. And so the more that we feel that the outside person's will is trying to control and influence us, the more we're going to have a rise in us in reaction to that. And so counterwill is not a learned response. It is not something that children pick up from home because their parents are oppositional and resistant. It is actually an instinct that we are all born with. And it is an emotional reaction. And so there's a combination of instinct, a primal survival-based instinct, and also connected along with emotions that play a critical role in preserving the sense of self of that person to becoming your own person. And so I'm already starting to hint about one of the purposes behind counterwill. And so, and I'll get to that in a second. Bear with me. I'm going to walk through 2 slides before I get to unfolding the 2 purposes. And so for us to believe that resistance and opposition must be unlearned, so if we believe that it is a learned response, that we have to unlearn it into the child, teach them differently, we are going about this the wrong way. And so the belief that resistance and opposition must be unlearned doesn't recognize the value, the developmental benefits of having one's own mind, first of all. And second of all, fails to appreciate that we need to grow a child out of their resistance, not punish or teach them to behave otherwise. This was a sentence out of Deborah's book called Rest, Play, Grow. She has a whole chapter that she dedicates to opposition and resistance, and so does Hannah Beach, for those who have read the book Reclaiming Our Students. So both Reclaiming Our Students and Rest, Play, Grow are terrific books, developmentally, use a developmental lens, and they both have a chapter dedicated to this phenomenon. And so the point that Deborah is trying to make here is that until we can make sense of this phenomenon, then sometimes our misunderstanding of it can push us in the wrong direction. And so it's not about teaching it that's going to affect change, or trying to put on consequences or rewards that is going to help shape the child in a certain way. So before I get to the purpose, we're going to look at why is it that children are moved by their counterwill instinct? And I'm saying children, but all of us, both adults and adolescents and children, all of us are moved by this instinct. And so first of all, it is a natural instinct, and it has an intended purpose. We are all, as I was saying, we're all born with this instinct. It is actually quite healthy for an individual to show some tendencies of the counterwill instinct. It is not the instinct in itself is not a problem. It's not that we shouldn't have it. It has a purpose. The problem is when we stay stuck in that mode. And so when we stay stuck in that mode, then the person may have difficulties with experiencing their vulnerable feelings around that situation that may cause more stuckness and the opposition and the defendedness and the resistance, excuse me. And the child might have a hard time trusting the adult that is trying to lead them, which in that they may not feel cared by that adult, or they may feel exploited by that adult. Not that that's what the adult is doing. This is how the child is feeling about that situation. And so the more they're having a hard time trusting the adults, the harder it is for them to follow that adult and to take their directives. So now we're going to look at the two purposes to counterwill. The first purpose to counterwill is to serve attachment. It is to protect our young ones against outside influence and direction. Think about if the child were to be out there in the world without you. Let's say they're at the park and a stranger comes along and tries to bribe them to come with them with candy. We want our children to resist the influence of strangers, because if not, this would be actually quite dangerous for their livelihood. And so counterwill is meant to rise outside of our attachment villages. And so within the attachment village, if the child is attached to those that are within their village, there is a greater chance that they will follow them, take their lead, and that they will abide to the directives. But they will not do this randomly to strangers. They are not meant to answer to strangers. And so even if you are working in a school and you're a staff in the building, who are you to the kids that you're working with? Kids do not respond to a role. They don't respond to you simply because you're a teacher, or simply because you're a support staff, or simply because you're an administrator. It is not about your role. They respond to you if you are a somebody to them in their village of attachment. And so if you become important to them and that they feel connected to you, then they will there's a better chance that they will listen and follow you if you are within that circle of attachment. And so please be careful that you don't take by default that because you're an employee of the school or board, that just because of your name tag as an employee, that it means that the kid by default should listen to you. It doesn't work this way. And so it serves attachment by protecting against outside influence and direction. Now, remember that out of all species in this world, there is no other species that that people will give their young to others outside of their village of attachment to help teach and grow them. Think about in the wild and with the animal kingdom. No animal will give away their young, and I mean outside of the village of attachment. And so, of course, if we look at un troupeau d'animaux, of course, within that group, there will be, the elder animals that are looking out for the young, and the young will answer to different adults within that circle. However, they will not answer to outside of that circle because it could be a question of danger. And so even though, humans are different than animals, of course, we're much more sophisticated, in many different ways. The instinct to survive is still very much primitive and very much similar to animals. And so we are meant to respond only within that village for safety purposes. And so, on the one hand, it serves attachment. On the other hand, it serves development by preparing the way for separate functioning. And so, all of us in our journey to development, in our journey to become our own person, to become a person who is autonomous and that is able to survive without being completely dependent on others. This requires for us to create a somewhat of a bubble around us to discover who we are. Who am I? What are my if we go back to the will, what are my goals and purposes and values in life? What are my intentions, initiatives? What are my preferences, my opinions, my judgments, my expectations, my hopes, my plans, my wants, my wishes? All of these things require somewhat of a bubble for an individual to be able to discover within the bubble without outside pressure and influence. Who am I and what are these different attributes of my will? And so in order to be able to develop that, whoops, sorry, I'm not on the right slide. In order to be able to develop that, in order to develop your sense of emergence, emergence is that process that allows you to become that separate being. And so you need to have a bit of a resistance and a pushback to be able to have enough of that bubble to discover who you are. And so it is quite normal and healthy for you to have counterwill tendencies. And so, as I was saying, if we unfold each of them separately, counterwill serves attachment by protecting against outside influence and direction from those not within the parent sanctioned village of attachment. Children were designed to be impossible to manage unless sufficiently attached to those in charge. It is the default dynamic in a child that serves to protect them and to keep them to safety. And so hence the importance of a good parent-teacher-school relationship. And the problem, and then it's also the issue with substitute teachers, because of course, substitute teachers, unless they're the substitute often with the same group, they are visitors to the kids. And so it makes it that much harder for substitute teachers to lead a group because of this dynamic. And for a teacher within or a school within the grander scheme of things, if there isn't that is included in the family's village, if there isn't a relationship between the home and the school, it makes it much more difficult for the school to have influence on the kids because the kids are seeing home and school separately. They're not seeing them as together within the same village. And oftentimes, especially with those families that the parents are very, and I'm saying parents loosely, that, the caregivers. And so the caregivers are very frustrated with the school system because they themselves as kids have had negative experiences and have held on to that. And so they will criticize the school, criticize the teacher to the child. And so when this happens, it makes it much more difficult for the school staff to be able to influence the child because the child is feeling that these are two competitive entities. And by default, in the attachment instinct, will want to be loyal to their families first. And so how can we work on coming the two together, building that sense of belonging, that sense of community, that sense of togetherness? This is so needed and necessary in order for schools to be able to do their job. And what hasn't helped us in today's society is that schools have now become more regional. Schools back in the day were much more local. They were much more connected to the neighborhood, part of the community. Those who worked in the school lived even in that community. And so now that school systems have kind of enlarged in their territory and now take care of regions rather than taking care of neighborhoods, and that the personnel that work in the schools don't necessarily live in those regions. It has really changed quite a bit, that dynamic. So why is it that, you may say to me, Catherine, we're in February now, and you're going to say, Catherine, I've been working really hard all year at building a relationship with my students. And I want to say that for the most part, I do have a pretty good relationship with most of them. We get along. I like them. They like me. We have fun together. Why is it that I still experience opposition and resistance on maybe not on a daily basis, but that I experience this in the school or in my classroom? And so, to pose that question, why does a child oppose an adult when to whom he or she is attached to? And so the thing that we need to understand is that there is a difference between having the attachment and the child being attuned to your attachment in that moment. Are they engaged vis-a-vis you in that moment? And so I'll give you an example just to make it concrete. It's recess. Kids were playing in the yard. They were playing different games. They were with each other. And so as the bell rings and it's time to go in that moment, although they loved their teacher, in that moment they were playing with their peers. And so they were oriented towards their peers. They were not engaged with the adults unless there was a game where the adults played with them and then the adults were, involved and the kids were engaged with the adults too. But if the adults were just there kind of walking around and supervising the yard, and that the teacher was in the class, and then when the bell rang, they came to the door to pick up the kids, there was nothing in those 20 minutes of recess where kids were able to stay attuned to the adult. And some kids can hold on that long. And so even if they were with their peers for 20 minutes, they're easily engaged with their adults, that even being away from the adult for 20 minutes, when they come back, the bell rings and they come back, they're able to easily attune back to the adult. But many kids have a very hard time with that. They have a hard time transitioning. And so in that moment when the bell rings, they are attuned to their peers. And so when the adults are trying to say to the kids, come on, let's go, line up, now it's time to get to class. And the teacher is saying to the kids, stop misbehaving in the line. You need to stand, properly and hold yourself straight and you guys need to keep a certain distance. The kids are, if they're not attuned to you in that moment, there is nothing in them that is pulling them to follow your directives. And so we need to re-engage those instincts for some kids every single time after a transition. And so when the directive is given, the child is attached to someone else or something else. And so if the child is not attuned to you in that moment, then they are not receptive to you. The other reason that could influence this is that there was some counterwill in this child's system. And so maybe something happened first thing in the morning before they came to school, where mom and dad really rushed them to get to school. Come on, Johnny, now come on, hurry up. Now it's time to put your socks on, put your boots, let's go. And then rush to get to the bus, rush from the bus to the schoolyard, rush from the schoolyard to the classroom. And so they have this accumulation of pressure and coercion and even it could be like days and days of accumulation of this. And maybe that morning, Johnny couldn't resist and oppose mom and dad because mom and dad were so frustrated with Johnny, so upset that Johnny felt that it wasn't the time or place to be oppositional and resistance, because maybe mom and dad were so angry that they would have gotten a smack or something, a consequence, if they had resisted and opposed mom and dad in that moment. And so they kind of put that into their system. They kind of, contained it for that moment, but it didn't disappear. It stayed in their system. And so when they arrived at school, and now the bell rang for the first, for the first entry into school, into class, and all of a sudden Johnny is super resistant to the adults. And then the adults are looking at themselves and thinking like what happened? Like there's nothing that explains what happened to justify this reaction. And so this is the thing with instinct, and the same thing, by the way, with emotions. If emotions and instinct stay contained and accumulate in your system, if they were not released in the moment for different reasons, and we call were kept at bay, then they will eventually come out at a different time. Emotions and instinct don't dissipate on their own. If we get triggered by a situation and it doesn't get released, it will stay accumulated in your system until it finds an out. And so you kind of need to see this as electricity. When there's a charge, there needs to be a release, a decharge. And so think about those students that you work with that have a lot more opposition and resistance than other kids in your classroom. And now start thinking about their life situation. You know, what is happening at home with their caretakers? What is their life reality? What are those challenges in their day-to-day that may be creating more out, control, out of sense of out of control and coercion from their environment? And so the more these kids have an input of that, the more they will have the it's how can I say this? It's proportionate. The more that you get triggered, the more there's a need to release. And so if the child in that moment is not connected to the adult. So to go back to the first purpose about the attachment. And so yes, they have the good relationship with the teacher, but in the moment they're not attuned to the adult. And so if they're not attuned to the adult in that moment, then the command coming from the adult, if it feels greater than their desire to comply to you, then they will not follow that. The counter will come out and will react as a pushback or an opposition or resistance. If the obligation of the task is greater than their urge to make it work or their motivation to try, then you will see counterwill. If our expectations are grander than their desire to please us, counterwill may come out. If our demands are greater than their inclination to defer to us, to follow us, then counterwill may come out. If the degree in which we put on pressure, because now the adult is getting frustrated and upping the ante, is greater than the desire for the child to measure up to the adult's expectations, then counterwill may come out. And if the adult's forcefulness is grander than the child's desire to be good, then you may see opposition and resistance. And so we need to be very careful, not just about whether or not the child is attuned to us in the moment, but what is the proportion between our will and the child will? And if our will in that moment is grander than the child's will, then there's no way through in that moment. And so, you're going to say to me, well, so how do I go about my day? Because the education system is filled of expectations and obligations and demands and so forth. This is part of the design of how schools are made. How are we supposed to get through our days if this is the way counterwill works? And so I promise you we're going to get to that in the second part of the presentation. Right now we're unpacking this, and I will be answering this question. Now, in terms of the second purpose of developing our sense of self, so counterwill serves development by preparing the way to serve for separate functioning. And so the first step is for the individual to find their own will, which instead focusing on resisting and countering the will of others. And so if they're able to find their own will, the more they're able to figure out who they are, what they want, what their preferences are in life, what's their direction, the less they will feel controlled and coerced by their environment, and the less they will feel threatened by other people's will. I should mention here that when a child is very young and immature, and so young in chronologic age, so thinking about, the preschooler, the 4 or 5-year-old, but also thinking about older kids that are just stuck developmentally and have somewhat of a preschooler type personality. For those individuals, they have a hard time to have perspective because their prefrontal cortex hasn't yet developed enough So it is one element at a time. So for them, if it is one element at a time, they have a hard time having enough perspective to have both their will and the other person's will exist at once together. And so when you become more mature and you start having more perspective and you're able to tolerate differences, then you don't have as big of a problem to have a difference of opinion or to have a difference in your plans or your wishes in life. It doesn't bother you in the same way. And so, but however, a young person for whom it is one at a time, it is much more challenging for them to accept these differences. It becomes a bit of a paradox for them and it creates pressure. And so I'm going to show you this image to be able to kind of explain what it is that I'm talking about. And so if we have the will of others out there, so we have their ideas, their agendas, their attentions, their judgments, their expectations, and so forth out there, and that the person's emergent self is somewhat developed, but not developed enough. And so the person doesn't know their own will, their own intentions, and so forth. Then the outside person's will feels like more coercion and pressure to them. And so as the individual grows up, so not necessarily grow older, grows up, builds prefrontal cortex capacity, builds maturity. And for those that have taken other courses with me in the past, I mentioned that maturation is not something you teach. Maturation is something that unfolds naturally if the right conditions are there. So our job as the adults is to set up the right conditions. And right conditions are, for the child to feel safe, for the child to feel understood, for the child to have space to be able to express themselves, to be able to discover their selves, to take risks and so forth, and to be accompanied in that. And so all of that are the right conditions that are needed and necessary to develop the process of emergence. And so the more that the person becomes their own person, the less they feel the coercion of others because they're able to hold on to themselves and to the others and to even compare it, even if it's different, and that's okay with them. But if you are very immature and your sense of self is tiny, then the other people's will feels so much bigger and creates in you so much more coercion. And so the counter will be so much stronger in those individuals. We see this a lot with our 2, 3-year-olds, that phase of the no, where they say no to everything. And the reason why they say no to everything is not only because they are working on developing their sense of self, but also because they don't have enough emergence to be able to tolerate the other people's will. And so this is why that we get so much pressure, the resistance and opposition from our 2, 3-year-olds, or even our 3, 4-year-olds. Um, you know, and then I'll be talking to the high school group this afternoon, and I'll be saying to them that even back at the adolescence phase, there is yet again another part of the journey of becoming an adolescent where we are focusing on discovering our sense of self. And so during that phase of exploring and discovering yourself, there's a lot more resistance and opposition that is happening because of the process of it and needing to push people at arm's length to be able to discover yourself. And so similarly to the other slide that we looked at before, this slide here of comparing the two sides of the equation, if the child feels that the adult's expectation is grander than their own initiative to complete the task, then you will see some opposition and resistance. If your pressure is grander than their sense of purpose, if your demands are grander than their sense of desire, if your have tos are grander than their want tos, if your directive, are grander than their intentions, if your input is grander than their sense of curiosity, if you're trying to use incentives and rewards and those are grander than their interest, then in all of those cases you may see a rise in opposition and resistance. And the issue with this dynamic is that not only do kids have the counterwill instinct, we too have instincts and emotions. we too get pushed, our buttons get pushed by the child's reaction. And so the because we're trying to stay in charge, and our alpha instinct, for those that have taken the alpha material with me before, the two instincts play together, the alpha and the counterwill. And so when we are trying to take charge, our alpha instinct is on, and that the child is opposing and resisting us. This is creating conflict in our system and pushes our buttons. It doesn't feel natural and right for the child to oppose us if we are meant to lead them. And so it may become a vicious circle where our instincts will get triggered by the child's instinct. And then if we react out of our instinct, then we may create more defendedness. We may create more intense emotions and instinct. And in turn, this may create more defendedness and immaturity. And then this will kind of like the snowball effect. This will push more behavior that will get us more upset. And then it becomes this vicious circle. And so rather than trying to control the child, first of all, we need to be attuned to our own instincts and where we find ourselves in that dynamic. And so rather than looking at it from the angle of what's wrong with the child and this behavior has to stop, we really need to shift our lens here and to look at it from the context perspective and say, oh my goodness, this child is experiencing so much coercion right now. And maybe it's not coercion from you, maybe it's coercion from the context or from the, the previously in the situation. And so we need to come alongside this. How can we help reduce the pressure in that child's system? And so going back to the proportion, how can we help them either build more of their attachment to us, to have the natural inclination and desire to please us and to follow us? And on the opposite, how can we help them discover their emergence and their will? And this is where, of course, this requires certain maturity. And so for younger kids or for kids that are more stuck and immature, it is difficult for them to find their own will. And so we can help plant that seed, but it is trickier to use this angle. It is more about focusing on the attachment with those kids. But for those kids that are more mature, to try to help bring out the will in them, to be able to limit that sense of pressure from the other side. And so what we need to help the process along is to help bring out the feelings that are civilized, that will help to neutralize the counter will impulse. And so if feeling the impulse to resist and oppose is there, because that's number one. Many times, especially with our stuck and defended kids, they are all in behavior, all in reaction. They have a hard time having a connection between their bodies and their minds. They do things but don't realize or recognize them. And oftentimes in those kids, it is because their feelings are disengaged. They're either too defended, they're too numbed out, and so they're not feeling their emotions, or they haven't had enough opportunities in their life to experience connecting their bodies and their minds and making sense of what's happening in their bodies. And so if they're able to feel that impulse to resist and oppose, then you can make it possible to take up a relationship with it. And I want to give the example as adults because it's easier to see it from that angle. And so think about us as adults, how often we are faced with situations that will trigger our counter will. And yet, even though we are triggered in our wanting to oppose and resist the situation at hand, we are able to have an inner dialogue with ourselves to be able to get through and past that impulse. And we will comply with the situation. It doesn't make us happy, but we're going to comply with the situation regardless. Think about COVID. COVID is such a recent and great, easy example to give. How many of us were very alarmed by the whole situation and didn't like the fact that we had to be isolated at home, didn't like the fact that we had to wear a mask, didn't like the fact that we had to disinfect our hands, didn't like the fact that we had to to get to vaccinated for that and so forth. And some of us actually were still quite oppositional and resistant to the government, even though, you know, we are somewhat mature and civilized. Depending on the adults, some adults were more compliant than others with this whole situation. And so the thing that we need to realize is not that we didn't have the impulse to oppose and resist the situation, but we were able to take a relationship with it and get ourselves past it and comply anyway, even though we had the inclination not to. And so, to go back to our kids, it's not about getting rid of this instinct. It's not about trying to teach them not to feel this impulse or to feel embarrassed or ashamed of having this impulse. We all have it. It is normal and needed and necessary to have it. I explained it earlier. Part of it is for survival purposes. And so it's not about trying to get rid of it. It is about trying to find a way for us to feel our emotions and instincts enough, to be vulnerable enough, and to have the time and space to do this, to be able to discover our will and our impulse to oppose and resist and create a relationship with it, to be able to find ways to slow it down and to neutralize it. And so this is one end of it. And of course, you can only take a relationship with it if you feel what we call the futility of the situation. And so to go back to the example with COVID, if remember when we had the what's it called it the nights the lights out at night, that we couldn't leave our house after a certain time, and that if people resisted and opposed that and went out, that we would get into trouble if we got caught. I mean, especially, I mean, those that had dogs obviously had, I'm taking a tangent here, but those that had dogs had that loophole. But those that didn't, if you went outside after curfew and that you got caught, you'd get into trouble. And so this was the boundary. This was the what we called the futility of that situation. And so many of us took up a relationship with the frustration of staying indoors, because we knew that if we did go outside, then what would be the consequences of that going outside? But in order for us to have a relationship with that impulse, we need to realize, first of all, that there are limits in this life. And many of our kids, for different reasons, whether because their parents haven't done that enough to put limits and boundaries, or because they are so defended that they are not seeing and experiencing those defenses and limits and boundaries, that they're having a hard time having a relationship with futility and accepting the fact that there is a limit and a boundary. And so you can only pick up a relationship with your impulse if you see and recognize and accept that limit. And then the third side of that triangle is, how can we not just have a relationship with it, but feel the conflict within us? And so the conflict between, on the one hand, feeling the impulse and the emotions of the counterwill, and on the other hand, having the alarm, the care, and the desire to comply, that will help neutralize the two. And so it's the combination of the three that allows us to become civilized within our impulse to oppose and to resist. So this is the way through. The way through is not about cutting it out, or about trying to find a way to bypass this and then just have the attributes. You can't just teach this. This is an experiential process. And if kids are not learning this at home, then unfortunately this falls back onto the shoulders of the school, to have the kids faced with these experiences, to work through them and to grow up from those. And so in terms of behavior, to go back to the first slide with the iceberg and all of the symptoms at the top, we cannot expect that behavior to change if the kid is not mature. And so it is normal for those that work with K4, K5, especially K4, they are not in a place yet where they have enough maturation in their brain to be able to civilize their impulse of counterwill. It is to be expected that their impulse to oppose and resist will be raw and will be unfiltered. Now, you may say to me, why is it that some kids, even at K4, are actually quite compliant and that they are not really oppositional and resistant. So how do you explain that if it is meant to be normal and natural at that age? And so the reason why some kids will be well compliant is due to other emotions and instincts. And so the need to please, the need to be connected and taken care of, we call this pursuit, or the alarm of disappointing the adult. Those different emotions will push aside the counterwill. And so remember, I had given the example before of it was here about the counterwill being left at bay when the child's at home because the parent is this the way the situation was happening, they just couldn't let out their counterwill in that moment. Well, the situation is true in the opposite as well. How many of our kids will actually not display this impulse at school because they're feeling so alarmed or such under pursuit that they will keep it at bay until they get home, and it's their parents that will get the brunt of it. And so this is why, in terms of going back to the 4-year-old, those that are more compliant and so forth, going back to the emotions, if they're not feeling their vulnerability, if they're not feeling the impulse to oppose and to resist, and that they are defended to the point where they are that they don't have perspective, also all of that kind of works together, then they don't have what they need in order to change those behaviors. And of course, attachment is so needed, not just to be attached, but to be attuned to the adult in that moment. So now, just want to be mindful of the time. So now we're going to look at, in terms of interventions in the classroom and in the building, what can the adults do now that we've unfolded this whole dynamic, this whole phenomenon? So how do we go about this? How do we support the students at the different level? So we're going to look at it through the lens of the pyramid of intervention. So we're going to start with the universal best practices for all in the classroom, or maybe even in the schoolyard. Look at the targeted practices for some students that need more, and we're going to look at the individualized and intensified practices for few students that need above and beyond. So in terms of the universal best practices for all, so those practices are used for the whole group. And so not just for some, we're talking about all the kids. We're doing this as a whole class approach or a whole school approach if they're outside in the yard or during lunchtime in the cafeteria. If it's in the classroom, those practices are often led by the teacher. But if we're talking about other times and spaces, whether in daycare or whether during recess outdoors, the adults that are there are the ones that are taking charge of those best practices. Those practices work best in the preventative mode. And so it is needed and necessary to introduce these strategies, to model them, practice them, and it's not just about what we do, it's also about the way that we've set up the conditions, the environment to help the child be more successful. And so, for example, how can we find ways to minimize exposure to additional pressure and coercion by the adults? And obviously, there's some that we can't control, but there's some that we can kind of maneuver to some extent by relying on structures and routines to convey the directives. And this helps to minimize surprises, so there's more predictability, and that helps with many kids. But also, there's a big difference between adults giving directives after directives, where we're saying, kids sit down, kids take out your book now, kids start at page 1, kids, and you keep on repeating in the loop all of the directives. I mean, listen to yourselves if you do this. Oh my goodness, is it so coercive? And absolutely does that create a stress into the system and can bring out counterwill. And so I invite you to rely on your structures and routines. And many of you do this already so naturally and beautifully, where we've got visuals in the classrooms, we've got posters with the rules and regulations of the class, we've got organization in our class, we've got the schedule of the day so kids know what's coming up next. We may have a morning message where we have the what we're about to do and so forth. And so all of these things are there to be able to help in terms of structure and routines, where you don't need to say every moment of the day different directives. Trying to engage a student's attachment and getting them to be receptive to you before you engage in that task. Gordon Neufeld calls this collecting before you direct. And so collecting meaning engaging their attachment instincts. And of course, offering an array of different support measures that will answer their different needs and challenges that may indirectly minimize the sense of coercion and sense of no control in their lives. And this will help kind of balance out a little bit the degree in which they get the input of coercion. So here are just a few examples to kind of highlight a little bit, like what are we looking for in terms of examples of counterwill at tier one? So oftentimes at tier one, the signs of coercion are much more are much more covert. They're not as obvious, they're much more subtle. And so for example, in the classroom, if we've given a task to do, that the child may do the task, but it takes them forever to do the task, where they are slowing down, taking their sweet time, taking forever to get their materials out, to turn to the page they need to turn at, to have the necessary materials. It's like they need to do it in 1,000 different steps before they actually get to the task. This is an example of counterwill at tier one. Much more subtle at tier one. Oftentimes, kids will procrastinate in completing a task. They may begin the task, but they take forever to finish it. And so these are examples of counterwill at tier one. In the schoolyard during transitions, examples of counterwill could be where the student is passively ignoring the adult's directive of, oh, I wrote line here, I should have wrote line. And so when the adults are asking the kids to stand in line, that we see this child who is kind of distracted, not paying attention, talking to other kids, this passively ignoring. This is an example of counterwill at tier one. Or that now it's time to return to class. The bell has rung, and the kids are hanging out in the yard. Let's say they're very, very far in the yard, and we're calling them to come to the line. The kids that take forever to get to the line, this is a form of counterwill. And so this is an image to show you the 3 different sections of the equation to keep in mind in addressing counterwill. And so the first one is around the attachment. And so have we engaged the child's attachment instincts before revealing our own will? And so if we go back to these examples in the classroom, before we say to the kids to start their task, have we taken the time to greet them first thing in the morning? Have we taken the time to do even circle time or chit chat with the kids, or just to kind of find ways to connect with them before we start our day? Or if they've just come back from recess, have we taken the time to just make sure that they're reoriented towards us before we move on to the task? And some teachers do this beautifully. They play games with kids to get their attention before they start, the lesson. And so trying to get their attention is actually the same thing. Well, to some extent, you have to make sure that it works. It's the same thing as engaging their instincts. And so trying to make sure that all the kids that are there in the class, are they oriented towards you, looking at you, and that they are ready to receive the information. And the same thing in the schoolyard. I often say this to parents, and I'll say the same thing to you guys in a different way. Parents sometimes will yell to their kids from upstairs or downstairs in a house to hurry up to get ready. Kids do not respond well to directives that are given from a different room. And so you need to make sure before you give a directive that the kid is even looking at you, that you are that they're receptive, that they're in that dynamic with you first before you give the directives. Because if their kids are talking to each other in the classroom and you're just yelling out, kids stop talking, and they're not listening to you, they're not looking at you, they may not even have heard you, that now you're raising your voice. Sometimes a way around this is to close the lights. Sometimes closing changing something in the environment to be able to get them to pay attention that something has shifted in the environment. This can help to make sure they're oriented towards you before you get on to the task at hand. The other piece is in terms of the degree in which you're using coercion. And so making sure in your tone, in your posture, in your language, how are you talking to the kids? Are you saying, come now? or you know, like the tone you're using, you're being very bossy. We need to be really, really careful in the way that we say things, and even our posture. Are we like crossing our arms and frowning our brows as we're looking at the child when we're trying to give them a directive? This does not help to minimize the sense of coercion for the child. We need to be more strategic to find ways to get around it rather than trying to kind of break, you know, kind of like going head to head to try to break the situation and have the last word. I promise you, with a child who is very oppositional and resistant, the more that you yourself are digging your heels, the more they will dig their heels. And so we need to be the more mature one and to find ways to be able to work around it rather than trying to plow through. And then, of course, trying to draw attention to their own will. So those are the three parts of the equation. And so some of them I've already given you guys the examples before, but here are some pictures about, you know, having the routine there, the structures in the routine, you know, just having the visual of having the portion of the schedule that we're velcroing off of the not done to done, and now we're at this next level. That helps to be able to move the kids along without coercion. Trying to teaching the routines in a fun way, using music, using movement, using play, making them really engaging. Where, you know, if we want the kids to be quiet, maybe pretending about the different animal voices, the difference between a lion and the mouse, to be able to help them understand the volumes of the voice, especially with the little ones. It really helps to make that difference. I talked about this already, to be able to collect the child before you engage into the directives. And certain kids have a hard time being engaged. And so we need to take a extra little attention and time to do this. Some kids need a one-to-one engagement. Some kids with the whole group, you can do it very easily. Good morning, class. How are you doing this morning? We do a bit of a circle, you know, discussion, and that's enough. And some other kids, you need to come closer to them in proximity, maybe come down to their level and share something with them first to be able to engage them. You really need to take it to the next level to be able to create that engagement. And of course, using the power of play to jumpstart the relationship. Hannah Beach, who's the author who wrote Reclaiming Our Students, has an example in one of her editorials where she talks about collecting kids in a fun and playful way. And she herself was a teacher once. And in that example, she talks about the fact that she had props at her desk. And what she would do is that every single morning, the kids got to select a different prop that she got to wear during circle time, and it kind of made it silly and fun, but it also made it engaging where the kids got to choose which of the props that she had to put on. And so this is just one example. I'm sure you probably have your own, but trying to find a way to make it more fun and playful. Now, in terms of, I talked earlier about kids that when they are engaged in other relationships with other people, that it makes it difficult for them to transition from one person to the next. You know, if they're at recess with their peers, trying to be re-engaged by the adult. There's a reason behind this. There's a reason why this works this way. The reason why is because attachment actually has a polarity. It has a positive and a negative polarity. And so when you are in the positive polarity, when you are attuned to that person, everything in you, in your instinct of attachment, is pushing you, your desire to please them is pushing you to follow their lead and to take their cues. But the opposite is true too, that if you are not attuned to that person in that moment, that there is nothing in you to be to follow their directives and to be engaged, especially if you're attuned to somebody else, and that somebody else is not part of the whole village. And so giving the example of peers, if some kids are very peer oriented and follow more peers than they do the adults, it is much more of a struggle for those adults to gain the trust and the receptivity of that kid, because that kid is listening to the kids, their peers, above and beyond the adult. And so this is why having the circle around the positive polarity, and the adult is left out of that circle. And so how can we try to find a way to be able to get the kids to reorient towards you? And collecting is the way to do this. And for those kids that are hard to collect, through like natural, just greeting or just, sharing a story or whatnot. Play is the way in with those kids. And so I want you to think about for a second, as you're thinking about your kids and your setup in the classroom or the setup in the schoolyard, what are the practices that you are using to engage the students' attachment and receptivity in your day-to-day? What are those activities or what are those strategies? And so some examples could be, like, as I mentioned, through play, getting them to practice using your directives and taking your lead. Simon Says is a wonderful game because Simon Says is exactly about getting kids to follow your directive and take your lead in the play mode. And the other one that's really wonderful is the red light, green light. And there's other games that exist as well. And so to be able to use music or singing or dancing to get them the mind off the coercion and to get onto the fun and get on board can help with that. The other thing that might be really beneficial, I mentioned earlier that if we don't get to release the accumulation of our instinct, that it stays stuck in our system until it finds an out. How about we play games to let that accumulation of instinct out? Playing at saying no, playing at different games where there is a back and forth in following and not following directives. And I'm sure you guys are more creative than me at this, but being able to get them to release the accumulation of counterwill can help dissipate the degree and intensity in which the counterwill will come out when it's time for it to come out. Now we're going to move at tier 2, where we're going to look at the interventions only for some students that need more targeted interventions. And those are oftentimes kids that struggle in the classroom. Some students are more challenging, whether the challenging is more situational or it's happening for a short period of time. Oftentimes those practices are led by the adults, either the teacher in the classroom or by other adults in other spaces and time. And of course, support staff may help out with those kids. Oftentimes, those strategies, interventions can be done in the class, but also out of the class, in the hallway, in other spaces of the school, and they can be done with the help of support staff. Please keep in mind that tier 2 interventions need to be done above and beyond tier 1. We never need to lose out of sight the benefit of tier 1 intervention. So we're doing tier 1 and we're adding to that tier 2. So examples of counterwill at tier 2 are the following, where we may have a student that has started to do work, but as the work got more difficult, now they've dug their heels and they're refusing to do the work. Even though we're trying to convince them to do it, that they are not budging, or that they're openly not participating in a group activity, where we put them into small groups and they are not actively participating. Or they stay quiet and they're just listening, or that they may say something but not saying much. And even if the kids are asking them, it feels like pulling teeth to kind of get them to participate. During recess or during transitions, that they may resist the transition between the homeroom teacher and the specialists, or that they have a good relationship to the homeroom teacher, and so there's less resistance and opposition in that time of the day. But as soon as they go see the phys ed teacher or the music teacher, oh my goodness, do we see much more counterwill happening with those adults, because they don't see them as often and they're having a harder time building that relationship. Or that we may see some kids that oppose the rules of the games, and that the others are, let's say they're playing, I don't know, tag, and now all of a sudden that kid, got tag, you're it, and then they're saying, no, no, like, or they change the rules of the games or something like that, that this would be examples of counterwill at tier 2. I want to invite you to think about, for those tier 2 kids that are more challenging, how many in their day are they faced with have tos, involved with the classroom and school experience above and beyond, above and beyond having the have tos in their learning situation, things that they've never done before, things that they don't feel good at, and so forth, and also the have tos that are present in their day-to-day lives. And so think about the combination of all of these 3 categories of have tos that they have in their lives. And this will give you an idea of how much input those kids are getting. And so trying to understand now that we've done that exercise for those kids, that it is really, really difficult for them in certain situations, especially when we're talking about new learning situations. How much for those kids it can provoke counterwill, the resistance to complete, the resistance to even try. And some of it has to do with alarm and avoidance, but some of it has to do also with counterwill, or the two come together, where new learning might be difficult, not knowing what to expect, unpredictability is difficult. The the fear of looking inadequate, especially in front of peers, confirming through this activity, where as they're doing it, it's not going the way that they think it's going to go, that this confirms their sense of inadequacy, and that they are afraid that if they do this wrong, that this is going to disappoint the adults, and that they are going to lose the attachment to the adults. And so some kids don't dare even try because they're afraid of disappointment, or not just that they're afraid of failure, they're also afraid of disappointment. And so all of that can have an impact on counterwill. Being careful with those kids in the way that we address them, not doing this publicly, trying to address them privately to avoid the escalation of the power struggle. In terms of backing off, sometimes when the child is digging their heels, it's not the time to try to do further power struggle. At that moment, it is time sometimes to take a step back, to say to the student, oh, I need to go and attend to another task, or oh, and I see another student has asked me a question, I'll be back. Sometimes taking a step back and giving a bit of distance to the kid helps to be able to minimize the pressure in the system. It can help reduce the pressure. Trying to find ways to lead out of the impasse of the power struggle. And so maybe you'll use humor or play to try to diffuse the situation, or you'll try to distract the focus on the coercion onto something else. Or that you may say to the kid, I understand the opposition to this task. I do get that it's a difficult task. How about, so we give an option, how about that we focus on this instead first, and maybe we'll come back to that after, and maybe I'll give you a choice between this and that. And so sometimes that helps to diffuse a situation and to draw the attention away as well from the coercive element. Being careful about our body language. I mentioned this before, about using a commanding or prescriptive manner in our tone, that making our agendas less explicit. Sometimes we are too open about what it is that we want from the kids and what upsets us about what they're not doing that we want them to do. We need to be much more strategic. Think about the dance that you have with kids, like playing poker. You cannot show your hand to kids. You cannot show them where you are feeling frustrated, where you are feeling powerless, where you are feeling inadequate. This is an adult information that needs to be kept to yourself. And so focusing on making the agenda less explicit, refraining on using language like you have to, you should, you must, and being careful in being more forceful and upping the ante to try to get what we want, because this will backfire with a tier 2 and tier 3 kid. Engaging their attachment instincts beyond the collecting. And so talking to the child about how we know that it is hard for them, with the have tos, to normalize the fact that even us, we react to when we have to do certain things, and allowing time and space for the child to build a relationship, pick up a relationship with their instinct, to come alongside their counter will. Play and playfulness helps along the way with this as well. Being playful to diffuse a situation. In terms of the directives, being more playful in the way that we give directives, and using stories to be able to that are similar to the situation at hand, that can help diffuse a situation. So we're talking about the character in the story rather than talking about them and their opposition and resistance. And so the other piece as well, going back to the student's will, but of course, the student needs to be mature enough to have their own will. What practices are we making use of in the classroom, to be able to have the student's own will come out, their own initiative and involvement, and so forth. And so I want you guys to think about that. On the CBM website, we have a placemat that speaks to ideas that we can do at tier 1, 2, and 3 in the classroom and on the playground that can help diffuse resistance and opposition. I invite you to go and take a look at that placemat. Here is the link for it. At tier 3, now we're talking about individualized practices. Those students, and there's few of them at this point, are highly challenges, and those are the kids that don't do well in the classroom. Oftentimes, these are kids that have adapted schedules and spend time in other pockets of space in the building. With those kids, no single one adult can manage them on their own. We are meant to work at this collaboratively between the classroom teacher and the support staff, the administration, the board consultants and professionals. We're meant to kind of plan this together as a team to be able to personalize and individualize the plan for the student. Um, Sometimes we need to refer for further investigation, getting the consultant and professional to help out. Maybe we need more adaptations and accommodations to having a one-to-one pullout for that student. And again, we need to add on tier 3 measures to tier 1 and tier 2 measures. And so examples at tier 3 would be so much more frequent, so much more disturbing, and so much more explicit in the way that they come out. And so in the classroom, we may see a student who rails against the daily routines and adult expectations. So it's not just once in a while when there's a task at hand that's too difficult. This is happening regularly almost on a daily basis for those kids. And even for activities that are easy for them to do or that are fun and engaging, that we see the constant opposition and resistance. We can see with those kids that they may interrupt the adult that is speaking, or the other kids that are speaking, and speak over them, that they don't willingly respond to authority. They may say something like, "You're not the boss of me." And so this may be a typical type of response from those kids. That during recess and transitions, they may impose themselves onto others, invading their personal space, especially if they're not invited to play. Or they may disrupt the game that others are playing, especially when they're not invited to join and play in. And so these are examples of counterwill at tier 3. Those kids at tier 3 are very stuck in their counterwill instinct and are truly challenging. It really is a continuum from having tendencies of showing some counterwill at different times to now having chronic exhibition of the counterwill instinct. Those kids are much less receptive to being led in general. They're highly resistant to directions and guidance from others, from adults. They're often less endearing to us, and they tend to alienate us, and we want to try to work with them, but oh my goodness, do they push all our buttons? And it is normal and natural for us to have our buttons pushed. It's not that we shouldn't be pushed by our buttons. I think that it's normal for us to pick up a relationship with our own counterwill and alpha instinct vis-a-vis the counterwill of the kid. And the thing that gets confusing sometimes is that those students appear more independent and much less needy, and it's actually quite the opposite. They need us so much more, but because they are often in resistance and opposition, they cannot rely on us for support and help because of so many different reasons. And so they come across as independent and not needy, and it's actually quite the opposite. And those kids are very difficult. It's very difficult to get them to be in a state of rest and satiation because they're not able to depend on to the adults. And the last thing that's really important to keep in mind is that consequences and sanctions are highly provocative to those kids. And so we need to be much more strategic with those kids than any of the other students that are displaying some counterwill. And so it's important to consider all the elements involved if in those cases, who the child is, what's their profile, what's their life situation, what's their attachment capacity, in terms of the context at hand, the environmental stressors, and so forth, whether the child is engaged or receptive, and the adult in the moment, what is the adult stress level? What is the insight of the adult into the child, but in themselves? Are we being reflective in this moment, or are we being reactive? And in terms of our nonverbal, I've spoke about this already. With tier 3 students, they absolutely benefit from having one-to-one daily check-ins and even multiple daily check-ins. Having the teacher greeting in the morning is not enough for those kids. They need an ongoing check-in, not because the adult wants to tell them what's next to come. We are doing this in a non-agenda way. It is simply for wanting to engage with that child, showing them in authentic way that we care about them and we want to be there for them. This is so needed to soften their defenses, because if they think that we don't care about them and that all we want is to get them to oblige, they will not follow our lead. So we need to first take time to collect them, and check-ins are so needed and necessary for those kids. If for different reasons they cannot stay in the classroom because they are so stuck in their resistance and opposition, we need to be careful in what way they are leaving the classroom. We cannot do this with consequences and with timeouts. This will create more defendedness, and this will make, remember the image of the vicious circle? This will continue to feed into this vicious circle. We need to set up a preventative adapted schedule for those kids where they've got time reserved out of the classroom to give respite to the child, to give respite to the group, to give respite to the adult that is trying to teach the group. And those kids during those break times are given other things to do to help kind of reset them or to release the accumulation of coercion in their bodies. And so we can use things like You've Got Mail that I have on my website, or that we can send them on an errand. We can use the Nurturing Support Center if you have one, or an Oasis room if you have one, where the support staff can work with this child one-to-one. And so having a personalized and adapted schedule, individualized support is so needed for those kids. Trying to increase their village of attachment. These are the kids, excuse me, that have a hard time trusting the adult. They have a hard time attaching. And so if we know that they have one adult that they trust in the building, whether it's their teacher, the support staff, the administrator, whomever it is, sometimes it's the caretaker, that we have that adult work on building the relationship with between not just the two of them, but with other adults. So the other adults can now become part of that village. And so introducing the other adults, the substitute teachers, the specialists, the new adults that come into the building and so forth, the adults that have a hard time building that rapport because a child is so resistant, to go through the attachment to matchmake, to build that rapport. Sometimes parents can help with this to be able to build that relationship. Being careful, because they push our buttons, to not let counterwill break the connection. Not taking counterwill personally, understanding the kids are not doing this on purpose, it's their survival instinct. Anticipating and expecting that we will see counterwill with those kids. This will happen on a regular basis with them. Reflecting their resistance as natural and normal given the counterwill, and trying to help them to get around that. Not using consequences and discipline that makes more separation. Not making the behavior the bottom line. Gordon Neufeld calls this bridging. Being careful that if we've had a bad day, that we say to the student, I know today was hard. Tomorrow's another day. We'll try again. You are my student. I am going to continue to work with you. I know, I believe in you. I know we're going to get there. This is what we need to do to not make the behavior the bottom line. And if there was some damage that happened in the incident from the previous day or the previous moment, to be able to repair those damages from the counterwill fallout. Say to the child, that's not what I meant to do. I know this was not your intention. I know that today was a difficult day, and when you have a hard day, that that your counterwill comes out more often than, and so forth. Working on trying to repair that. And so when you are faced in a battle of the wills, being careful about pursuing and reinforcing the power struggle, you need to recognize when you're being alienated, to take a step back, not to focus on controlling the child, focus on controlling the circumstances. Saying something like, Let's say the child is opposing an activity with the whole group, that we say to the whole class, now children, I've decided that this task is perhaps not a good idea for us to pursue right now. How about we do this now instead, and we'll get back to it later. And so rather than publicly going face to face with a power struggle with the child in front of the whole group, that we find ways, we bluff, we pretend, that we all along in our mind had a different idea, and that now we're shifting it, not because the kid is resisting us, but because we've decided that we're shifting the situation. There is nothing wrong with us changing our minds. Only the saying of Einstein, that what's the saying that I forget now, but that the fact that we continue the same thing, insanity, that insanity is us trying the same thing over and over and over again, and not changing our minds and thinking we're going to get a different result. And so it's about, it's okay to shift our mind, or shift or change our minds about shifting the situation. There is nothing wrong with that. The other kids won't think that we're being a pushover. The biggest fear that we have as adults is that if we change our minds, or that we strategically kind of shift things in the situation, that it makes it look like as if the child who is resistant and oppositional has won. I promise you that when a child is being oppositional, the other kids don't think that you've lost your posture as the leader. The other kids think that that child has gone rogue and has taken a tangent. And so you need to focus on the group, not on that child. Sometimes having the child go on an errand to leave the classroom can help diffuse the situation, and get focused back onto the rest of the group. And be careful, though, that if the child does go on an errand, that we're not doing this day in, day out, because at some point we need to continue to work on the relationship with that student. Because if we send that kid all the time to other adults, not only are we giving away our power to other adults, but we're losing opportunities to continue to build the relationship with that kid, to deepen that attachment, and to get them to be attuned to us. And without that, there's no way through. And so we really need to find time, even if it's not during class time, during recess, we go and spend 5 minutes to have a snack with them, chit chat with them. It's so important that we continue to have a relationship with those kids, even if they're not often, they're not in class all day, every day. Being careful about the language that we use. Sometimes the language that we use can be quite provocative with those kids, and triggering. And so I give other examples of how to shift our language. In conclusion of this presentation, talking about our role as adults, and our role is the three following: adjusting our view about counterwill, adjusting our stance around counterwill, and making room for the child's will and the child's opposition and resistance in different ways. I invite you to go and take a look at the CBM website. I've got tons and tons of resources. I have a whole section dedicated to resistance and opposition, with materials and ideas and so forth. I talked about 2 books, Rest, Play, Grow, and Reclaiming Our Students. There's a whole chapter dedicated to this phenomenon. And there's also editorials that are available on this phenomenon. You can share these editorials, share them with parents, share them with colleagues, talk about this with your different colleagues, because if they don't know about this phenomenon, this dynamic, it changes everything. If you don't know how to handle it, then how can you be successful? So I will stop sharing. I will stop the recording.